Roy Clark always looked like Buck Owens' best friend on Hee Haw. The truth was very different. On screen they laughed together. Off-screen they barely spoke. For years fans believed they were partners in everything. But at 87, Roy finally told the truth about the tension, the distance, and what really happened with Buck Owens. For Clark, the show was a gift. It made him a household name, gave him freedom to entertain the way he loved, and connected him to millions. For Owens, it became a burden. The jokes felt beneath him, the image a cage he could never escape. One man leaned in, the other pulled away, and their silent standoff lasted decades. So why did they keep the truth hidden? What was really going on behind the corny skits and the music? And why did Roy Clark wait until the end of his life to finally reveal what fans had never suspected? Roy Clark and Buck Owens could not have been more different when their careers first began. Roy was born in 1933 in Meherrin, Virginia, into a working-class family where music was both an escape and a calling. By the time he was 14, he was mastering not just guitar but banjo, mandolin, and fiddle. That versatility would follow him for life. He didn't just play songs, he entertained, his playing full of energy, humor, and warmth that drew people in. As a teenager, Roy was already competing in national banjo competitions. He won the National Banjo Championship twice before he was 18. He also became one of the youngest performers ever to appear on the Grand Ole Opry. That combination of raw skill and natural charm set him apart. Unlike many country musicians who stayed regional, Roy adapted quickly to television. By the early 1960s, he was a frequent guest on The Tonight Show and the Beverly Hillbillies, and soon he was headlining in Las Vegas. Buck Owens, born 2 years earlier in Texas before moving to Bakersfield, California, took another route entirely. He built the Bakersfield sound, a raw, electric alternative to the polished Nashville sound dominating country radio in the 1950s. Owens' hits like Act Naturally and Together Again cemented him as a hitmaker with a sharp ear for production and a ruthless commitment to quality. He was less interested in jokes and more focused on building something lasting both musically and financially. Buck's rise was also tied to his sharp business instincts. He secured ownership of his recordings, bought radio stations, and opened his own music publishing company. By the time Hee Haw came calling, Owens wasn't just a star, he was a mogul in his own right. These parallel lives reveal the contrast that defined them. Roy Clark was the entertainer who could win over any room with a smile and a joke. Buck Owens was the businessman-musician whose guard was always up. The stage was set, two men, two philosophies, on a collision course toward one of the most successful variety shows in American history. But when they finally sat side by side on national television, the contrast that made them magnetic to audiences would also become the seed of a lifelong distance. In 1969, CBS took a gamble. Hee Haw was pitched as a country-style version of Laugh-In, mixing music with quick-fire comedy sketches. The network needed two stars to anchor it, one with proven chart success, another with charisma and wide appeal. Buck Owens brought the Bakersfield hits. Roy Clark brought the personality and showmanship. From the very first episodes, audiences responded. The format was simple: cornfield jokes, musical guests, recurring characters, but it was the chemistry between Owens and Clark that gave the show its heart. They looked like best friends. Owens, straight-faced and dry; Clark, warm and playful. The contrast worked so well that many viewers assumed the bond continued off stage. But privately, it didn't. Buck Owens disliked the show's corny humor, finding it beneath his reputation as a serious musician. He was already uneasy about how much the image of Hee Haw Buck was overshadowing his Bakersfield legacy. Roy, on the other hand, leaned into the comedy, grateful for the exposure. He knew that millions of families, many who had never heard of him before, were now inviting him into their living rooms every week. When CBS canceled Hee Haw in 1971 as part of its infamous rural purge, most assumed the show would fade. Instead, syndication saved it, and it became even bigger, lasting more than 2 decades. By then, the show was unstoppable, and so was the myth that Roy Clark and Buck Owens were as close off-screen as they were on it. But behind the laughter, Owens was already pulling back, distancing himself from a show that was making him richer than ever and unhappier than he had ever been. Throughout the 1970s, Hee Haw was a ratings juggernaut. In rural America, it was more popular than late-night talk shows, with reruns syndicated in nearly every market. The cast of recurring characters, Junior Samples, Minnie Pearl, Grandpa Jones, became household names. At the center of it all were Roy Clark and Buck Owens. For Roy, the show was transformative. It expanded his reach far beyond country music fans. He was soon headlining in Las Vegas, performing for presidents, and even guest hosting The Tonight Show. His easygoing presence made him welcome everywhere, from small-town fairs to primetime television. To him, Hee Haw was proof that comedy and music could live side by side without shame. Buck Owens experienced the opposite. While the paychecks were large and steady, his identity as a groundbreaking musician was being eroded. Wherever he went, people recognized him, not as the sharp Bakersfield pioneer, but as that guy from Hee Haw. Privately, he resented the show's impact on his career. He feared it had made him a caricature in the eyes of serious fans and critics. This difference deepened the personal distance between Clark and Owens. They remained professional, never letting the audience sense any tension, but they did not socialize, did not call one another, and did not share much outside the studio. Fans assumed their laughter was real. In truth, it was the performance of two men who respected each other's talent but lived in separate worlds. And that distance was noticed not just by them, but by others. Cast members later hinted that Roy was the heart of the set, joking with the crew and keeping spirits high. Buck kept to himself, polite but reserved, as though the entire production was a job to finish, not a family to belong to. The divide wasn't hatred, and it wasn't open conflict. It was quieter than that, an unspoken rift that widened as the years went on. And while the cameras told America they were brothers in comedy, Roy Clark later admitted the truth the Bond fans believed in had never existed. By the mid-1980s, Hee Haw was still a juggernaut. Its corny sketches, bright costumes, and down-home energy made it irresistible to millions of viewers who wanted comfort television. Roy Clark was thriving in that spotlight, but Buck Owens was quietly unraveling inside it. Buck was a perfectionist at heart. In Bakersfield, he had crafted his sound with precision, battling against Nashville's dominance and winning. To him, music was serious business. Every lyric, every guitar riff mattered, but Hee Haw presented him as a punchline, a straight man to corny jokes, surrounded by hay bales, cornstalks, and bikini-clad Hee Haw honeys. For a man who had built his reputation on grit and discipline, the show felt like an insult. It didn't matter that the checks were enormous. Owens was earning millions from syndication and royalties, but he hated what it was doing to his name. Privately, he admitted he felt trapped, too successful on Hee Haw to walk away, but too proud to truly embrace it. The result was bitterness. By 1986, Buck made the decision. He stepped back from Hee Haw. While reruns ensured his presence lingered, new tapings leaned more heavily on Roy Clark and the rest of the ensemble. Clark, once one of two equal anchors, was now the undisputed heart of the show. Fans never saw the shift as a fracture, but within the industry, it was understood. Buck Owens had grown tired of laughing when he wanted to be taken seriously. And yet, even as he walked away, Buck couldn't fully escape the shadow of Hee Haw, or the unspoken divide it had carved between him and Roy Clark. Roy Clark and Buck Owens both became wealthy from Hee Haw, but the way they approached their success couldn't have been more different. Roy remained loyal to the show. He saw it as a blessing, a chance to reach millions who might never buy a country album, but would sit down with their families on Saturday nights. He loved the silly skits, the musical performances, the joy of making people laugh. For Clark, Hee Haw was never a cage. It was a stage, one he was grateful for until the very end. Buck, meanwhile, thought differently. He was as much a businessman as a musician. Long before Hee Haw, he had secured his music publishing rights, invested in radio stations, and built an empire in Bakersfield. He saw Hee Haw through that same lens, a lucrative venture that needed to be managed, maximized, and controlled. He monitored contracts, royalties, and syndication profits closely, ensuring he received his share. But while Buck treated it as business, Roy treated it as joy. That difference was felt by everyone on set. Clark would stay late, joking with the cast, picking up his banjo just to play for the crew. Buck was more distant, often leaving as soon as his parts were done. He wasn't cruel or dismissive, but he kept to himself, protecting his energy and his brand. To fans, both men were equally important. To Roy, the show was a calling. To Buck, it was a deal, and the gap between those philosophies left no space for a real friendship. Years later, Roy admitted that Buck had a wall around him, one that even decades on the same stage could never break down. By the time Hee Haw was deep into syndication, both men were icons. Yet privately, both carried unspoken truths. Buck Owens eventually admitted in interviews that he had grown to dislike the image Hee Haw had created for him. He confessed that he was embarrassed by how the show overshadowed his work as a musician. Fans loved the corny humor, but Owens wanted to be remembered for Together Again, not for telling one-liners in a cornfield. He went so far as to say that if he could redo his career, he might have left Hee Haw earlier. Roy Clark, by contrast, never hid his gratitude. In interviews, he acknowledged the distance between himself and Buck, describing Owens as a man few people truly got to know. He never attacked or criticized him. Instead, he spoke with a kind of quiet sadness. He respected Buck's talent, admired his discipline, but admitted they were never close. The friendship fans imagined simply wasn't there. Still, Clark recognized that without Buck Owens, Hee Haw would never have worked. Their contrasts had made the show magnetic, even if it cost them personally. As Roy grew older, his perspective softened further. He no longer saw the distance as rejection, but as the natural result of two very different men forced to share the same stage. In the end, both carried regrets. Buck regretted how Hee Haw had reshaped his image. Roy regretted that the laughter they shared on stage never extended to life off stage. And when Buck Owens passed away in 2006, Roy Clark finally said aloud what fans had never suspected, that the bond they believed in was an illusion. Buck Owens died in 2006, at the age of 76. His passing sent shockwaves through the country music community, especially in Bakersfield, where his Crystal Palace nightclub stood, as both a monument to his legacy and a gathering place for fans. For many, it was the end of an era. For Roy Clark, it was complicated. When asked to reflect on his longtime co-host, Clark chose his words carefully. He praised Owens' talent, his influence on country music, and his vision as a businessman. But there was no dramatic confession of a lifelong friendship, no nostalgic stories of camaraderie behind the scenes. Roy made it clear, in his own gentle way, that the connection fans believed in had been limited to the screen. That honesty was striking. In a world where stars often embellish their histories, Clark's refusal to rewrite the truth said more than any glowing tribute could. He respected Owens, he admired him, but he would not pretend they were closer than they had ever been. In later interviews, Clark finally gave language to the silence. He said Owens carried a wall around him, one few people could penetrate. Clark himself had never broken through, yet he still acknowledged that together they had built something extraordinary. Hee Haw was bigger than either of them alone. Its reach had outlasted the critics, the cancellations, even their own differences. As reruns continued into the 21st century, Younger generations discovered the show and once again saw Roy and Buck sitting side by side, smiling as if they were brothers. That image, preserved on tape, became its own kind of truth, even if the reality was more distant. And when Roy Clark reached his late 80s, he no longer held back. He revealed what really happened with Buck Owens, not to diminish his legacy, but to finally set the record straight. Roy Clark and Buck Owens were two men who defined country television. They shared a stage for decades, but they never shared their lives. Roy leaned into the humor, grateful for the platform. Buck recoiled from it, haunted by how it overshadowed his music. Together they created a cultural phenomenon that neither could have built alone, even as it quietly kept them apart. At 87, Roy Clark admitted what millions of fans never suspected: there was no deep friendship, no secret bond behind the laughter. There was only respect, distance, and the fragile balance of two men who needed each other to succeed, but never truly connected beyond the spotlight. That revelation doesn't tarnish their legacy. If anything, it makes it more human. It shows how even the brightest partnerships can be complicated, how legends can stand side by side without ever standing shoulder to shoulder in life. Roy Clark's final honesty pulled back the curtain, not to expose scandal, but to reveal the truth that the image of brotherhood was a performance, and the real story was far more complex. Their legacy lives on in reruns, in music, and in the memories of fans who laughed along with them for decades. And now, thanks to Roy's candor, we see them as they really were, not inseparable friends, but two very different men who built something unforgettable together. For more emotional stories, check out this video.